Question number 6. You would like to let the text input automatically focus when arriving on the page. Which solution would you apply for defining the form? So question A, question B, or question C? So notice the autofocus attribute. So in question A, it's within the form. It's got an attribute called autofocus equals name. Option B just has autofocus as an attribute within the form. And option C has a value of autofocus as an attribute for the input. Solution is, correct answer is C. For this goal, just use the autofocus attribute on the wanted form input itself. So whatever input that you want the autofocus to be applied to whenever the page loads, then that's going to be the input that you're going to apply the autofocus attribute to. So going into our example, so if we want to set the autofocus on the telephone value, we would set the autofocus attribute. So now when we refresh the page, we automatically have focus on this element. So we're automatically focused on the input type telephone with the pattern and where the autofocus is applied. Question number 7. What is the difference between an input with text type and an input with email type? Option A, they both are accepting normal characters, but the email type only accepts a valid email address. B, the input with text type is multi-line, the input with email is not. C, the input with a text type accepts only numbers, the input with email not. D, the input with text type cannot accept the @ character, the input with email type does. So make your selection, and I'll provide you the solution afterwards. So the answer to the question is A. There is little difference between the two inputs. They are both accepting normal characters, but the email type only accepts a valid email address. So that's correct, where we've got the valid email address when we apply the type of email to the input. So that's a big difference there. Question number 8. What is the general use of an input element with search type? Option A, this is not an existing concept. B, it is used for defining a text-like input for entering a search query on forums with the post form method attribute. C, it is used for defining a text-like input for entering a search query on forums with the get form method attribute. D, it is used for defining a text input where a dropdown helps the client to find the proper keyword. So what does the input element with the type of search, what is it used for? And if you answered C, you're correct. The input was introduced by HTML5. It is used for defining a text-like input for entering a search query on forums with the get method attribute. So let's set up the get method and specify the attribute for the form as get. And then we'll also create an input with a type and specifying the type of as search. So this is going to be where we've got our search input. And I'm also going to remove out the required from the username and from the email. So let's try that out. Do a refresh. And so now we've got our search field. And you can enter in content into there. And the difference between what we see with the search as opposed to what we see with the search input, we've got an X there. And what the X does is that allows us to really easily clear the contents of the search input. Question number 9. You would like to let a client give his website address URL in a valid format. Which solution do you apply? Do you use the input with the type URL? Do you use the input with a URL type and a correct pattern, do you use the range input or do you use a text input? So which one would you select for the client in order to provide a proper URL address in a valid format? A, input with the URL type. B, input with the URL type and correct pattern. C, range input. D, text input. Make your selection. And the correct answer to number 9 is A. By default, the URL input is going to make a proper validation. For this reason, we don't need to use the pattern attribute. So let's go ahead and add another input to our form, and we're going to select the type, and the type is going to be URL. Let's save that and then go out to the example. So within the example, when we refresh it, and I know we don't have the labels on the inputs, so it is hard to distinguish between them, but we can select within the browser URLs that we've got the URL type input here. So this is this one here. So let's enter in some content, hit submit, and just like we saw with the email, when we hit submit, if this input has a value and it's not properly formatted, then it's going to be flagged and we're not going to be able to complete submitting. So let's try adding in a web URL and hit submit, and we are able to submit the form at that point. Question number 10. You would like to let a client give his phone number in a valid wanted format. Which solution would you apply as a web developer? So solution option number 1 is A, use the input with tell type as the type of input. B, use the input with tell type and a correct pattern for the option to provide the phone number. Option number C, use the range input. Option number D, use the text area. So your client wants to give his phone number in a valid format. Which solution would you apply? And the answer to this is option B. By default, the tell input is not going to make a proper validation. You should use patterns for this goal. And we saw that earlier in one of the earlier examples of when we were using patterns.